26. This was a familiar one, wasn't it, Ellie?
Yeah, I know it by memory.
You know it by heart, okay?
I say it every Sunday.
That's right, well, let's hear it.
Yes. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again." May God bless the reading of his word.
Amen. Thanks, Ellie. Yeah, those are familiar words, aren't they? We hear them each week here in worship. This is something that at our church we do in every worship service. We have our time of communion, and normally it's we call those the words of institution. And they are familiar. It's kind of like the Lord's Prayer. It's just so familiar and so beautiful. It can kind of get us right into that moment of communion. And the way we need to feel when we come to communion, and that's really what we'll be looking at today is just what are we bringing to this moment of communion? These words that we hear today, they're Jesus' words. We also read them in the Gospel of Luke, but they were quoted by the Apostle Paul, and he was writing them to the church in Corinth because they had it's the kind of issues that come up in churches. I mean, not the exact issues, but it's the kind of thing Paul had to deal with because they were having communion, and the way they did it back then is it was more like a fellowship dinner. Communion was a fellowship dinner. You came and you had a meal. And unlike our fellowship dinners, though, there was wine, and so people drank too much wine, some people, and they got drunk at communion, at the Lord's Supper. And then there were other people who came in and they ate all the food, and they didn't leave enough food for their. And some of us have been at the end of the line in the fellowship supper and have had something like that happen. You know, it's a little disappointing. But think about how disappointing it is when it's the Lord's Supper, and you're coming there for this very special purpose. And so Paul wrote these words. He wanted them to remember what was important about the Lord's Supper, and how do we make sure that we keep Christ in this moment when we come to this table. Well, today is World Communion Sunday, and we do remember that we're a part of a greater church today. There are churches all over the world, and all of them celebrating communion on this Sunday. Some churches don't celebrate each Sunday, but they try to make a point to celebrate. So all Christians will be celebrating communion on one day, and that's today. And so we do remember that we are in a greater church than just our church here, just our community of churches. We are part of a greater church that spans the globe and also spans all times as well. And we remember Christians of all times as we come to this table. But it is easy for us when words become familiar, and maybe this happens to you when it comes to some very familiar words from the Bible or parts of worship, that they become so familiar they become a bit tarnished by frequent use. And so it's harder to see them. We don't really look at them. We hear them, but we don't really think about them. So let's take a moment or two today to polish off these words and to really think about these words of the Apostle Paul and what we can bring here to this table and these moments we spend together as a community of faith, communing with each other, but also communing with God. Well, one thing we know when we look at these words, and it actually kind of jumps out at you when you read the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul does not quote Jesus very often. That's kind of strange at first because, well, gosh, Paul was preaching the gospel. It seems like he would be quoting Jesus all the time, but he actually doesn't do it that often. You see, I think he kind of assumed that there were other people in the church who knew the stories of Jesus, who knew the teachings of Jesus. What Paul was more interested in, rather than telling about what Jesus said, he was most interested in telling about who Jesus is to us today and to the folks back then. He wanted to make sure we understood the importance of Jesus, and then he had this other really complicated task of also trying to understand, okay, we have all the teachings of Jesus, we know what Jesus said, how do we actually do it? How do we do it? We're all supposed to come together. We're supposed to be one family of faith. And then all of a sudden people are getting drunk at communion and they're eating all the food. And how are we going to do this? How are we going to keep ourselves together? So it's no surprise then that when Paul does quote Jesus, it is about the life of the church. And this is the central act in the church's life. One thing I say often to the pastor's class when I'm teaching them is to say, what's the last thing that we as a church would want to give up? That we would want to have to sell or have to give up? And what we end up usually deciding is the communion table. That's the one thing we absolutely need. We love our building, we love our instruments, we love everything. All of it comes down to this moment at this table. And if we can always gather here, then we can always be a church. And communion is so important. And Paul understood that, and he knew it. And so he quoted Jesus. And he quoted the two commandments that Jesus gave during the Last Supper. During this moment when he was asking them, and actually it's just one commandment. He repeats it twice, though, so it must be important. He called on us to remember. Take the bread, eat it, and do this in remembrance of me. And take the cup. It's the new covenant in my blood. Do this in remembrance of me. See, it's not complicated. It doesn't actually sound complicated. It sounds very straightforward. It doesn't sound very hard, does it? Because Christ isn't asking us at this moment to serve or to give or to sacrifice in any way. All he is calling us to do when we come here is to remember. But of course, we have the same disadvantages as those people in Corinth. We're being asked to remember an event we weren't present at. So we have to kind of use what we have learned. We call on what we learned from the Bible, what we learned from Scripture about that moment. And we remember that. And then our imaginations maybe fill in some of the details about what it looked like and how sort of the atmosphere of it all there on the night before Jesus was betrayed. Yeah, we have to use our memories of all that. That can be tricky. Our memories aren't that good. We hear this more and more as time goes by, more and more studies saying how really undependable our memories are. And I know you've probably felt this as you come together with people that you've known for a long time, and you sit down and you talk about old things, things that happened, and how everybody seems to remember it a little bit differently. Yeah, our memories aren't reliable. We can be absolutely sure that we are right and our memories are right, but when there are 5 people telling us, no, it happened slightly differently, it's hard not to doubt our own memories too. So what do we bring here then? These memories, we weren't even there. And then our memories about what was going on, what we've learned, what we've read in the Bible, they're not really that reliable. Well, there is one part of our memories, actually, that's really good. Actually, this part of our memory, this thing that we can remember, it gets better over time. It can become more refined and more pure. It can become sweeter. And that is the love that we have felt. Love does not diminish over time in our memories. Love stays strong. Other things diminish. Think about some of your memories, and it doesn't happen as much as it should, but it does seem to me that hatred has a way over time in our memory fading away. Anger, yes, I don't stay as angry about things. I forget about that anger. Envy, well, usually that just becomes something I don't even have to worry about because those circumstances have changed. Why would I still envy something I envied 30 years ago? Pain, fear, boy, that has a way of being forgotten almost immediately many times. And lust, cools right off. But love is something that we can and we do remember, and it can become even greater over time. I remember when I was 5 years old, my grandfather passed away. And I just remember a few things about that moment in time. I remember being picked up from kindergarten in the middle of the day. in order to go over to Silver Springs, Texas for his funeral. And I remember going in, and I remember my sister hugging my grandmother, and I remember seeing my father cry for the first time there at that funeral. There's not a lot I remember about my grandfather. I was 5 the last time I had seen him. Maybe I was 4 the last time I had seen him. But I remember he always wore a hat when he went outside, and he usually had a suit on as well. And he liked to go out into his garden in his hat and suit, and he would garden out there. He had a vegetable garden. And I remember going out there with him and helping him to pick tomatoes. I also remember he liked to take walks around the neighborhood. And I remember going with him hand in hand on those walks. And I remember he loved me. And I can still feel that love for him. In fact, my grandparents are all gone now. But I think I love them even more now than I ever have. For as I grow older, I tend to understand them better. I understand who they were, and why they did what they did, and what their worries were at different times in their lives. And I think that's going to continue as I grow older. I will understand them even better. Love has a way of staying with us and becoming even better, less selfish, less needy, more pure as time goes by. Well, this week, 3 of the children here in our church that we love, that we care for, who are in Sunday school, who are in our youth group, children that are up each Sunday just about here at the children's moment. They lost their mother. Little children. And there was no warning. So there was no time to prepare. No chance to really commit to remembering those things. Have that opportunity to prepare for that moment of losing someone. And so you take the time to really look at them, to hug them, to talk to them. There's none of that. No last words, no last kiss, no last hug. And we do know that these children who are so young are going to start losing a lot of those little details about their mom. But that's just the way of things. That's the way our memories work, but we don't worry about that. Not for them and not for us, because we know that they are going to remember what is most important. They're going to remember the purity of their mother's love for them. And they're always going to feel the love they had and have for her. They're also going to remember something else. They'll remember the love of their mother always, but they're going to think back on this week and on the months to come, and this year, this terrible year for them. And they're going to remember the sadness, and they're going to remember the pain. But they are also going to remember the great love shown to them by their neighbors, their family, their friends, their community, their church. They will remember that love surely. They're going to remember the kindness of their teachers and their principal. They're going to remember today when they came back to church today and were in Sunday school and felt the love of their Sunday school teachers and all the adults here. They're going to remember the love of their Father and the attention and care and concern He gave them, is giving them now, and will continue to give them for months and years to come, for the rest of His life. Now they're going to remember the pain of this week, but they're also going to remember the great love. Paul wrote also to the Corinthians, faith, hope, and love abide. But the greatest of these is love. And when we come to this table, that is what we are called to remember. Not all the little details. I mean, it doesn't matter to us if the bread we use today is different than the bread that Jesus used, that the liquid isn't wine, it's juice. But the table is different than the table that Jesus had. Those aren't the details we have to remember. All we need to remember is the love. See, that's what we do when we come here to this table each week. We not only remember that love of Jesus Christ, the love he shared with his disciples, we recreate it. We represent it here to each other and to the world. This table is a place where we can remember the love of Jesus Christ, a love that led to the cross, but a love that would not die there. A love that would live on and is still here with us today. Yes, this table is a place for us to come to grow closer to Jesus Christ. To feel our love for Christ to grow. To feel our love for one another to grow. As we remember through this bread and this cup, his great love for each of us. Let's bow in prayer. Loving God, we do give thanks that you offer us this table, this place where we can come and not only commune with you, not only to feel your love, but to show and to present our love that we have for one another. Dear Lord, help us to take this out into the week with us. Help us to remember this love that can exist in our hearts and that we can, if we choose, feel for all of your children. Lord, we do ask that you bless these elements of bread and cup to the nourishment of our bodies, to the nourishment of our spirits, that we may, in this moment together, be able to feel and to remember your amazing love. It is in Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.